If forbidden knowledge was truly dangerous, it would be gone by now. History has had thousands of years to erase it. Books were burned, authors were silenced, languages were outlawed, entire traditions were declared heretical, cursed, or insane. And yet the same ideas keep resurfacing, changed in structure, only renamed. That alone should raise suspicion. Guess destruction leaves absence. What we see instead is relocation. Every era claims to have eliminated dangerous knowledge, but every era also maintains archives, vaults, restricted libraries, sealed collections. The contradiction is obvious. If something must never exist, why preserve it so carefully? The answer is uncomfortable. Forbidden knowledge is rarely destroyed because destruction is inefficient. Burning creates curiosity. Erasure creates legends. Absence invites reconstruction. The more violently knowledge is attacked, the more durable it becomes. So systems learn something quieter. They stopped trying to erase. They began to reclassify. Knowledge is not denied, it is reframed. Sacred becomes heretical. Heretical becomes dangerous. Dangerous becomes irrelevant. And irrelevant knowledge does not spread. It decays slowly, not because it is false, but because it is no longer accessible. This is the real mechanism of control. What matters is not whether knowledge exists, but who is allowed to approach it, under what conditions, and with what language surrounding it. Labels do the work that fire never could. Fear replaces force. Confusion replaces censorship. This is why the most persistent texts in history are not openly taught or openly destroyed. They are preserved perfectly and isolated quietly. Not hidden in the dark, but buried in plain sight, surrounded by warnings, stigma, and complexity. Because a locked door is obvious, a mislabeled room is invisible. In this episode, we are not asking what knowledge was forbidden. We are asking why it was allowed to survive at all, and what changes when destruction is no longer the goal. Destruction has always been theatrical. When authorities burn books, they do it in public. When knowledge is condemned, it is announced loudly. When something is declared forbidden, it is framed as an act of protection. The message is simple. This no longer exists. But history tells a different story. True destruction leaves no trail. What we see instead are records, lists, inventories, and preserved fragments. Book burnings are not about erasure. They are about signal. They signal power. They signal moral authority. They signal the ability to decide what remains visible and what does not. But the act itself rarely removes knowledge from circulation. It only removes it from the wrong hands. Because burning everything is inefficient. To destroy knowledge completely, you would need to erase every copy, every memory, every practitioner, every derivative idea. That level of eradication is nearly impossible and, more importantly, unnecessary. Systems do not need absence. They need control. So destruction became symbolic. The crowd watches pages turn to ash. Fear is produced. Curiosity is discouraged. Meanwhile, copies survive, elsewhere translated, summarized, archived, or encoded. The knowledge is not gone. It has simply changed location. This is the illusion. Public destruction convinces people that something has been eliminated, while private preservation ensures it can still be accessed when needed. The performance satisfies the masses. Archive satisfies the institution. This dual process appears again and again. Forbidden texts are denounced while being cataloged. Dangerous ideas are condemned while being studied. The louder the rejection, the more likely it is that the material is being quietly secured, because power does not fear knowledge itself. It fears uncontrolled circulation. Erasure creates unpredictability. Once something is gone, it cannot be used, referenced, or repurposed. Control requires stability. A preserved text can be neutralized, contextualized, and restricted. A destroyed one can only be imagined. Imagination is difficult to govern. This is why destruction is almost always incomplete. Pages are removed, not entire works. Sections are redacted, not eliminated. Languages are restricted, not erased. The goal is to break continuity without eliminating content. Fragmented system looks harmless. Complete one invites reconstruction. Fragmentation is safer than absence. It keeps knowledge inert, While maintaining the appearance of authority, people assume the danger has been handled. They move on. Meanwhile, the structure remains intact beneath the surface, waiting for the right conditions to be reactivated. This is also why destruction is often selective. Practical instructions disappear first. Context is stripped away. Operational details are removed. What remains is symbolic, abstract, or confusing. The knowledge still exists, but it no longer functions. A non-functioning system is not a threat. From the outside, it looks like failure. From the inside, it is containment. The illusion of destruction masks a more precise operation, disabling usability while preserving ownership. This is the pattern that repeats across centuries. What is destroyed is not the knowledge itself, but its accessibility. Once access is controlled, belief becomes irrelevant. Public can think whatever they want. They can mock, dismiss, or fear what no longer works for them. The system remains untouched. The illusion succeeds because people confuse visibility with existence. If something is no longer taught, they assume it is gone. If something is no longer practiced openly, they assume it failed. But survival does not require exposure. It requires storage. Storage is power. This is why the most dangerous knowledge in history is never missing. It is always somewhere, cataloged, indexed, restricted, waiting behind classification rather than ash. Destruction is dramatic. Reclassification is permanent. Reclassification is quieter than destruction and far more effective. When knowledge is destroyed, it leaves a scar. Absence draws attention. Gaps invite reconstruction. People ask, what is missing and why? Destruction provokes resistance because it is visible, emotional, and final. Reclassification does the opposite. It allows knowledge to survive while ensuring it no longer functions in the same way. Nothing appears lost. Everything appears accounted for. The system remains calm, orderly, and legitimate, and that is precisely why it works. Reclassification does not deny existence. It changes meaning. A text is not erased. It is renamed. A practice is not banned. It is redefined. A system is not attacked. It is reframed as something else. Sacred becomes heretical. Heretical becomes dangerous. Dangerous becomes fringe. Fringe becomes irrelevant. At no point is the knowledge removed. It simply passes through layers of interpretation until it becomes unusable to most people. This is the real weapon. Once knowledge is reclassified, access becomes conditional. Not through force, but through language. Words decide who approaches and who retreats. Labels carry consequences long before rules are enforced. Forbidden does not mean false. It means approach at your own risk. Risk creates hesitation. Hesitation filters people more efficiently than violence ever could. Only those willing to cross social, intellectual, or psychological barriers continue. Everyone else self-selects out. This is why reclassification scales so well. It does not require enforcement. It requires agreement. The public learns to associate certain categories with danger, madness, immorality, or futility. Once that association is internalized, control becomes automatic. People no longer need to be stopped. They stop themselves. Classification turns curiosity into guilt. This is also why reclassification preserves plausible deniability. Institutions can truthfully say the knowledge was never destroyed. They can claim openness while maintaining distance. The archive exists. The text is available. Nothing is hidden technically. But the conditions surrounding it ensure few will touch it. This strategy is especially effective against operational knowledge. Operational knowledge is dangerous because it bypasses belief. It does not ask people to agree. It asks them to try. Reclassification prevents the try by surrounding the method with enough noise, stigma, and uncertainty that execution never occurs. The knowledge survives in form, but not in function. That distinction is critical. System does not need to be removed to be neutralized. It only needs to be separated from its context, fragmented into parts, and explained through frameworks that do not allow recombination. This is why reclassification often comes with overinterpretation. Texts are surrounded by commentary. Methods are buried beneath symbolism. Instructions are reframed as metaphor. What was once procedural becomes philosophical. What was once executable becomes interesting. Interest without application is harmless. This is how dangerous knowledge is disarmed without ever appearing censored. Reclassification also creates hierarchy. Once knowledge is labeled advanced, specialized, or unsafe, it requires credentials to approach. Credentials create gatekeepers. Gatekeepers create dependency. The system reasserts itself not by force, but by expertise. Expertise replaces authority. Authority becomes invisible. The irony is that reclassification often increases prestige while reducing access. A forbidden text becomes famous. A dangerous idea becomes iconic. Everyone knows the name. Almost no one understands the mechanism. This is containment perfected. The Ars Goetia, for example, did not disappear. It became infamous. Its reputation grew as its usability declined. Fear and fascination replaced practice. Discussion replaced execution. The method survived, but inert. This pattern appears wherever power must be controlled without confrontation. Burning books is crude. Reclassification is surgical. It allows institutions to claim rationality, tolerance, preservation, while achieving the same outcome as censorship without the backlash. The most effective reclassification does not feel imposed. It feels natural. People believe they arrived at their own conclusions. They decide something is too dangerous, too obscure, too absurd, or too complex to engage with. That decision feels personal, but it is conditioned. Once reclassification succeeds, knowledge becomes self-contained. It no longer spreads horizontally, stays vertical, passed quietly among those already inside the system, while the public circles around it without entering. This is why forbidden knowledge often survives best in controlled environments. Not because it is valued universally, but because it is useful selectively. Power does not destroy what it may need later. It stores it under another name. This is the final advantage of reclassification: reversibility. What is destroyed is gone forever. What is reclassified can be reactivated instantly. A label can be changed. A category can be reopened. Access can be granted. That flexibility is invaluable. It means control can adapt to circumstance. Tighten when necessary. Loosen when useful. Knowledge remains intact, but obedience remains intact as well. Destruction ends a relationship. Reclassification manages one. That is why it became the preferred method, not because it is more moral, but because it is more intelligent. If destruction is the illusion and reclassification is the weapon, the Vatican perfected the architecture, not as an accident, as a model. The Vatican did not survive centuries of ideological collapse by burning everything it feared. It survived by learning what to keep, what to hide, and most importantly, how to hide without appearing to hide. This is the distinction most people miss. The Vatican does not function like a censor. It functions like a curator. Curators do not erase. They select. They arrange. They decide what is visible, what is contextualized, and what remains inaccessible without ever being officially denied. Preservation becomes control. This is the core of the Vatican model. Preserve everything, seal selectively. When knowledge is preserved, it can be managed. When it is sealed, it can be neutralized. The combination allows power to claim moral responsibility while retaining strategic advantage. Nothing is lost. Everything is contained. This is why the most dangerous texts were never destroyed outright. Destruction is irreversible. Preservation is leverage. A preserved text can be studied quietly, stripped of context, reframed through doctrine, or weaponized when necessary. A destroyed one cannot. The Vatican understood early that absolute denial weakens authority. Selective access strengthens it. Access is the real currency. The Vatican model does not ask whether a text is true or false. That question is secondary. What matters is who gains operational value from it. If a text can grant autonomy, it must be sealed. If it can reinforce dependence, it can be taught openly. This is why theology flourished publicly while technique receded into the archive. Public doctrine focuses on belief, morality, and obedience. Private preservation focuses on structure, history, and method. One maintains social order. The other maintains institutional memory. The danger was never that people would read forbidden texts. The danger was that they would read them correctly. So the Vatican solved the problem without banning reading itself. It banned context. Languages became barriers. Access required permission. Fragments were separated from systems. Texts were preserved whole, but functionally disassembled. This is sealing. A sealed system looks intact from the outside but cannot operate as intended. The mechanism exists, but the conditions for execution are missing. Without context, knowledge becomes inert. Inert knowledge is safe. The Vatican also understood something more subtle. Secrecy draws attention. Silence does not. So the most effective seals were not dramatic. They were bureaucratic. Catalog numbers, restricted shelves, academic framing, time delays. Knowledge buried in complexity stays buried. This is why the Vatican archives are not hidden behind fire and guards alone. They are hidden behind process. Requests, credentials, waiting periods, language proficiency, approval chains. Not by force, but by friction. Friction is the most elegant form of control. Only those with persistence, alignment, and institutional tolerance proceed. Everyone else disengages. The seal remains intact without ever being acknowledged as a seal. This model also protects reputation. The Vatican can truthfully say it preserves history. It can claim transparency while maintaining restriction. The archive becomes a symbol of responsibility rather than suppression. Criticism loses traction because denial is unnecessary. Nothing is destroyed. Everything is preserved. And that preservation becomes proof of benevolence. Yet preservation without access is indistinguishable from erasure in practice. The difference is that erasure invites protest, sealing invites resignation. People assume what they cannot reach is either irrelevant or dangerous. Both outcomes serve control. This is why the Vatican model is so resilient. It does not rely on belief in authority, it relies on exhaustion. The effort required to cross thresholds is greater than the perceived reward. Most people never reach the door. Those who do arrive already conditioned to obey protocol. By the time access is granted, the threat has been neutralized. The text is no longer a system. It is a historical artifact. This is the ultimate reclassification, turning something functional into something academic. Once knowledge is academic, it can be discussed endlessly without ever being applied. Discussion replaces execution. Analysis replaces autonomy. The Vatican did not fear knowledge, it feared replication. Replication bypasses permission, creates parallel authority. It breaks monopoly. Sealing prevents replication, while preserving the option to reverse course if needed. This is why the Vatican model has outlived empires. It does not oppose truth, it manages access, and access determines power. This model also explains why forbidden knowledge tends to resurface in fragments, myths, or distorted forms. What escapes the seal does so without context. Pieces circulate without coherence. The system appears broken. The danger seems exaggerated. People dismiss what they cannot assemble. The dismissal is part of the seal. By the time someone realizes a pattern exists, the cost of reconstruction is too high. The knowledge remains theoretically present but practically unreachable. The seal holds without ever being enforced. This is not suppression, it is containment. Containment allows power to appear neutral while remaining dominant. It removes urgency, it dulls curiosity, keeps autonomy theoretical rather than operational. This is why the Vatican did not burn everything associated with forbidden knowledge. It did something far more effective. Kept it. And by keeping it, it ensured that only those already inside the system could ever decide when, if ever, it would be allowed to matter again. If reclassification is the weapon and preservation is the method, the Ars Gaudia is the clearest example of how the system works in practice. Because the Ars Gaudia was never destroyed. It was neutralized. Historically, the Ars Gaudia should not exist in the form we know it today. A text accused of summoning demons, undermining religious authority, and enabling autonomous interaction with non-human forces should have been erased completely. Instead, it survived, cataloged, referenced, translated, and circulated in fragments. That survival is not an accident. The Ars Gaudia was too structurally valuable to destroy. It provided a map of hierarchy, naming conventions, seals, timing systems, and command logic. Even stripped of belief, it contained something institutions recognized immediately: a working architecture. and architectures are not burned, they're repurposed or sealed. The first step was separation. The Ars Goetia was removed from its operational context and reframed as demonology. Once framed as a list of demons, the focus shifted from how it works to what it represents. Representation is safe, function is not. Demons became characters. Seals became symbols. Commands became superstition. This reclassification changed how the text was approached. Readers no longer saw a system. They saw danger, myth, or curiosity. The method disappeared beneath interpretation. Next came fragmentation. The Ars Goetia was rarely presented as a complete system. Pieces were isolated. Names circulated without context. Seals were shown without instruction. The logic binding them together was obscured. Fragmented systems cannot operate. They can only confuse. Confusion is containment. Then came moral saturation. The text was surrounded with warnings, theological commentary, and exaggerated consequences. Madness, possession, damnation. These outcomes were emphasized not to describe reality, but to discourage testing. The cost of curiosity became too high. Fear finished what fragmentation started. What remained was an infamous text that few dared to engage with seriously. The Ars Goetia became famous without being functional. Its reputation grew as its usability declined. This is the ideal outcome of reclassification. The knowledge survives. The threat disappears. Yet the text was never eliminated because elimination would have created uncertainty. What if something valuable was lost? What if something useful was destroyed? Preservation keeps options open. A sealed system can always be reopened. A burned one cannot. This is why the Ars Goetia was allowed to exist, but only as an object of study, not application. Once the text is academic, it loses teeth. Academia encourages analysis without execution. Endless debate replaces experiment. Footnotes replace results. The system becomes a subject rather than a tool. That shift is subtle, but decisive. The Ars Goetia was turned into information without access. This is also why it was associated so strongly with Solomon. Solomon provides legitimacy without replication. His authority is framed as singular, divinely granted, and historically sealed. By anchoring the Ars Goetia to a unique figure, the possibility of repetition is quietly removed. Solomon can command, you cannot. Out. That implication is never stated outright, but it permeates interpretation. The method becomes exceptional rather than transferable. The system is admired, not used. This is how dangerous knowledge is made safe. But the Ars Goetia reveals something else as well. God, despite reclassification, despite fear, despite fragmentation, it never disappeared entirely. Why? Because systems that once worked leave traces. Logic can be reconstructed. Patterns can be noticed. And curiosity persists longer than control anticipates. The very effort to neutralize the Ars Goetia proves that it was not nonsense. Institutions do not invest centuries in containing what does nothing. They contain what might be reused. This is the uncomfortable implication. The Ars Goetia was not feared because it opposed theology. It was feared because it bypassed mediation. It treated power as something that could be accessed through structure rather than permission. That lesson could not be allowed to spread, so the Ars Goetia became a warning instead of a manual, a legend instead of a system, a symbol of danger rather than a method of operation. But legends still point somewhere. Systems that survive reclassification remain dormant, not dead. They wait. Burning books looks decisive. That is why it is almost always a mistake. Destruction feels powerful because it is visible. Fire creates closure. Ash suggests finality. The crowd believes something dangerous has been eliminated. Authority appears strong. The message seems clear. This ends here. But history shows the opposite. Burning books does not end knowledge. It amplifies it. Destruction turns information into legend. Once something is publicly erased, it stops being evaluated and starts being imagined. People no longer ask what it contains. They ask why it was feared enough to destroy. A question is far more dangerous. Curiosity thrives on absence. When knowledge is burned, its value increases. It becomes scarce. Scarcity attracts seekers. What was once niche becomes forbidden. What was once technical becomes symbolic. Symbols spread faster than manuals ever could. This is why book burning consistently backfires. Fire removes content, but it creates mythology. Mythology does not need accuracy to survive, only needs intrigue. Once something becomes mythic, reconstruction begins through memory, rumor, fragments, and reinterpretation. Fragments are enough. A complete system requires discipline to study. A fragmented one invites imagination. Imagination fills gaps creatively, often exaggerating power and danger. That exaggeration ensures the idea persists even when the original text is gone. Burning accelerates this process. It also signals insecurity. Authority that burns books announces that it cannot manage what the books contain. That admission weakens legitimacy. It tells observers that the knowledge was not merely wrong, but uncontrollable. Even if that was not the intention, it becomes the perception. Perception matters more than truth. This is why sophisticated systems abandon burning as a primary tactic. They learn that destruction is noisy and temporary. It attracts attention and invites resistance. The more dramatic the suppression, the stronger the rebound. Knowledge behaves differently than objects. You can destroy an artifact. You cannot destroy a pattern. Once a pattern is recognized, it can be rebuilt from partial data. Burning removes reference points, but it does not remove logic. In some cases, it clarifies logic by stripping away complexity. What remains is the core idea simpler, more portable, harder to contain. This is especially true for operational knowledge. Operational knowledge is resilient because it is procedural. Even incomplete instructions can inspire experimentation. Experimentation creates variation. Variation creates survival. Burning books does not stop this cycle. It often accelerates it. This is why authorities learn to prefer disabling over destruction. Disabling preserves form while removing function. A disabled system looks intact but cannot be executed easily. It discourages use without provoking myth, keeps knowledge present but inert. Burning removes the object. Disabling removes the outcome. The latter is far more effective. Burning also creates martyrs. Authors become symbols, texts become causes. The narrative shifts from content to injustice. Once injustice enters the story, suppression becomes the villain. That role reversal undermines authority long term. Control thrives on neutrality, not outrage. This is another reason burning failed as a strategy. It forces power into a visible conflict. Visible conflict invites alignment. People choose sides. When sides exist, suppression becomes political rather than structural. Structural control prefers invisibility. By contrast, reclassification avoids confrontation entirely. It does not provoke loyalty. It does not create heroes. Quietly alters context until interest fades. Knowledge remains, but momentum disappears. Momentum is what burning creates. This is why the most enduring systems of control rarely destroy what they fear. They bury it under meaning. They overwhelm it with interpretation. They surround it with warnings, footnotes, and contradictions until engagement becomes exhausting. Exhaustion is more reliable than fear. A burned book invites reconstruction. A buried one invites neglect. Neglect is permanent. This is the strategic failure of burning. It assumes that eliminating an object eliminates influence. But influence does not reside in objects. It resides in relationships, between ideas, between people, between cause and effect. Burning severs one link while strengthening others. This is why, over time, institutions that survived learned to stage destruction while practicing preservation. Fire became symbolic. The real work moved elsewhere into archives, classifications, and controlled access. Publicly, books burned. Privately, systems were sealed. The spectacle satisfied the crowd. The seal satisfied control. This dual approach explains why burning appears so often in history, despite its failure. It is not meant to work. It is meant to convince. Convince the public that danger is gone. Convince dissenters that resistance is futile. Convince authority itself that order has been restored. Meanwhile, the knowledge survives changed, reduced, reframed, but alive. Because burning books is not about eliminating knowledge, it is about buying time. And time for a system built on control is often enough. Reclassification does not eliminate knowledge. redistributes it. This is the part most narratives avoid, because once access is examined, morality collapses. If forbidden knowledge were truly too dangerous for anyone, it would be sealed absolutely. No exceptions. No private shelves. No restricted circles. But that is never what happens. After reclassification, access does not disappear, it narrows. The first group to lose access is always the public. Not because the public is incapable, but because it is unpredictable. Large numbers introduce variance. Variance introduces outcomes that cannot be managed. Control requires stability, and stability requires limitation. So access becomes conditional. Languages become barriers, credentials become gates, institutions become filters. The knowledge remains visible enough to prove it exists, but distant enough to discourage engagement. This creates the illusion of openness while maintaining effective exclusion. Those who pass through these filters form the second group, authorized interpreters. Authorized interpreters are not chosen for belief, but for alignment. They understand the boundaries, they know what can be discussed and what must remain theoretical. Their role is not to operate, but to contextualize, to explain without enabling, to describe without demonstrating. They become buffers. Buffers protect the system by absorbing curiosity. Questions are redirected into analysis. Analysis replaces action. Action is delayed indefinitely. The knowledge is touched but never activated. This is how access is granted without autonomy. The third group is smaller and quieter, institutional insiders. These are not public scholars or visible authorities. They are archivists, specialists, advisors, and custodians of continuity. Their access is not symbolic, it is practical. They are allowed to see patterns whole, not fragmented. They are allowed to compare systems, not just texts. But even here, access is compartmentalized. No single individual holds everything. Knowledge is distributed across roles. One person understands structure, another understands application, third understands consequence. Fragmentation prevents replication, even among insiders. This is internal containment. It ensures that even those with access cannot easily reproduce what they study without collective permission. Authority remains centralized, even as knowledge is preserved. The final group, the smallest, is rarely acknowledged. These are emergent operators. They are not granted access. They reconstruct it. Emergent operators arise when fragments escape containment, when patterns reassemble across time and distance. When curiosity persists despite discouragement, they are not taught, they are not endorsed. They discover through inference rather than instruction. This group is the true target of reclassification. Reclassification is designed to prevent emergence. By breaking continuity, raising cost, and attaching stigma, the system reduces the likelihood that fragments will recombine into function. Most people disengaged long before that point, but not all. This is why reclassification never aims for perfection. It aims for probability. It does not need to stop everyone. It only needs to stop most, and most stop themselves. Fear, complexity, irrelevance, these filters work without enforcement. People choose not to proceed. They rationalize disengagement. They decide the knowledge is outdated, symbolic, or unsafe. This self-selection is crucial. It allows authority to claim neutrality. No one was banned. No one was stopped. The door was open. The fact that few entered becomes proof that nothing important was inside. But the distribution tells the real story. Public access is symbolic. Academic access is interpretive. Institutional access is partial. Emergent access is accidental and feared. This hierarchy reveals the actual concern: replication without oversight. Replication bypasses credentials. It bypasses approval. It creates parallel capability. That capability threatens monopoly not by opposition, but by redundancy. Redundant authority collapses quietly. This is why access after reclassification always follows the same pattern. The more likely a group is to replicate knowledge independently, the more aggressively it is filtered. The less likely, the more access it appears to have. Access is not about trust. It is about risk management. This is also why reclassification is never complete. Total sealing would require force. Force attracts attention. Attention attracts resistance. Controlled leakage, by contrast, creates noise without function. The system appears porous while remaining intact. Porosity is camouflage. People believe they are close. They feel informed. They discuss endlessly. But discussion is not access. Familiarity is not capability. The system remains protected, not by walls, but by gradients. The closer you get, the steeper the climb. This is the final refinement of control. Knowledge is no longer hidden behind gates. It is placed behind effort, doubt, and disorientation. Only those willing to navigate all three reach anything resembling operational understanding. And by then they are alone. That isolation ensures containment even when access occurs. So the question is not whether forbidden knowledge survives. It does. The question is, who is allowed to touch it without permission? And the answer explains everything. The pattern does not announce itself. It repeats. What survives across eras is not the symbol, but the mechanism. Names change, languages soften, the stage design updates. Yet the choreography remains identical. Preserve, reclassify, restrict, normalize. The first echo is always linguistic. Dangerous knowledge stops being called dangerous, becomes advanced, specialized, context-dependent. These words feel neutral, even responsible. They suggest care rather than control. But their effect is the same as a warning label. Approach slows, curiosity thins, access narrows. When knowledge is framed as requiring special preparation, the majority step back willingly. No force is required. Self-exclusion does the work. Those who proceed accept new conditions: training, supervision, oversight, until autonomy dissolves into compliance. This is not censorship, it is conditioning. The second echo is procedural. Access is never denied outright. It is delayed. Quests are acknowledged. Processes are outlined. Requirements accumulate. Each step seems reasonable in isolation. Together, they create attrition. Attrition selects for patience over initiative, conformity over curiosity. By the time access is granted, urgency is gone. The knowledge arrives as artifact, not catalyst. It can be admired, discussed, contextualized, but not easily enacted. The seal holds without ever being named. The third echo is reputational. Knowledge once feared becomes fashionable in diluted form. Symbols are celebrated while methods are sidelined. The public engages with imagery, narratives, and surface meanings. Engagement feels like proximity. Proximity feels like understanding. But understanding without execution is harmless. This is how reclassification matures. The knowledge is everywhere, yet nowhere usable. Familiarity replaces function. Debate replaces practice. The system appears transparent while remaining intact. The fourth echo is educational. Instruction is separated from outcome. Learning focuses on history, ethics, and critique rather than application. Questions of how are replaced by questions of why. Curiosity is rewarded with theory. Practice is postponed indefinitely. Postponement is containment. When people are trained to analyze endlessly, action becomes suspect. To act without exhaustive permission feels reckless. Responsibility shifts from capability to credential. Capability without credential becomes dangerous by definition. This inversion is subtle and effective. The fifth echo is moralization. Knowledge is framed as neutral only when handled correctly. Correct handling requires alignment with approved frameworks. Deviation is labeled irresponsible rather than forbidden. Responsibility sounds virtuous. It also transfers blame. If outcomes are undesirable, the individual failed, not the system. This moral framing neutralizes dissent. Concerns are reframed as personal shortcomings. Hesitation becomes prudence, and action becomes wisdom. The architecture remains untouched. The sixth echo is compartmentalization. Understanding is distributed so that no single person can reconstruct the whole. Specialization fragments perspective. Each part makes sense locally. System makes sense nowhere. Fragmentation ensures dependence on coordination, and coordination requires oversight. Oversight restores hierarchy. This is the most advanced seal. Complexity without coherence preserves knowledge while preventing synthesis. Synthesis creates leverage. Leverage creates autonomy. The seventh echo is distraction. Attention is drawn to debates that cannot resolve operational questions. Energy is spent on interpretation, identity, and framing. These debates feel urgent. They are also endless. While attention circulates, the underlying mechanisms remain unchallenged. Attention is a resource. Distraction is control. None of these echoes require force. None require secrecy. They operate in the open, wearing the language of care, responsibility, and rigor. The public is not excluded. It is invited into rooms where nothing can be assembled. This is why the pattern persists. It adapts because it does not depend on belief. It depends on friction. Friction slows movement until movement stops. The system does not need to convince anyone of falsehood. It only needs to make action costly. Cost reshapes behavior. Over time, people internalize the limits. They anticipate barriers before encountering them. Curiosity learns to negotiate itself downward. The seal becomes psychological. This is the final echo. When reclassification succeeds completely, authority no longer needs to intervene. People police their own access. They wait for permission that never arrives. They trade autonomy for reassurance. The knowledge survives in change in essence, but surrounded by conditions that ensure it remains theoretical. This is why nothing truly disappears. The pattern does not need to end. It only needs to continue working. It works because it is quiet, patient, and reversible. Labels can be adjusted. Access can be widened or narrowed. The archive remains. The seal remains. The public remains convinced that if something mattered, it would be available. That conviction is the most effective lock of all. Forbidden knowledge does not disappear. It's archived, reclassified, and surrounded by conditions until it no longer threatens the structure that contains it. Fire was never the solution. Silence was, complexity was, permission was. What was controlled was never truth itself, but access. As long as knowledge can be stored, it can be managed. As long as it can be managed, it can be activated only when useful and ignored when dangerous. This is why the most disruptive ideas are never erased. They are preserved perfectly and sealed carefully. The system does not need belief to survive, it needs hesitation. In the next episode, we move deeper, examining what happens when sealed knowledge begins to leak, and why control always shifts from suppression to internalization. Because when people stop asking for permission, authority finds a new way to speak through them.